I think of the moon and Artemis as being a stepping stone or being a springboard that will take us to Mars one day. In an astronaut's mind, Mars is the ultimate destination. It's the dream. We want to go to Mars to answer some fundamental questions that humanity has. Did Mars ever harbor life? We don't think there's life there today, but 3 billion years ago, we think that Mars teemed with oceans and lakes. And typically where water is found, there's a chance that life might have evolved there as well. So the Mars astronauts of 15 or 20 years from now will not find life there, but they may come home with a fossil. That'd be the news event of the 21st century.
I'm Peter McCully. That's Dr. Robert Thirsk, physician, engineer, and astronaut. On this edition of Today in BC, we'll chat with the member of the Order of BC, member of the Order of Canada, who also holds the Canadian record for the most time spent in space at 205 days. Thanks for joining us today, Robert.
My pleasure to be with you.
In New Westminster, you would have been growing up during the space race. Did you dream of becoming an astronaut at a really young age?
You know, I grew up during a real magical time. It was the 1960s and the 1970s. And society was moving quickly on so many fronts at that time. In science, in tech, and healthcare, civil rights, entertainment, music, everything was moving fast. It was a wonderful time to be young then. But most prominently, the space program. 1961, first human flew in space. And only 8 years later, 2 people walked on the moon. And that was mind-blowing for me. I was an elementary school student back then. So it was actually in Powell River, BC. I can remember the day very clearly. I went into my elementary school classroom and our teacher mid-morning turned on a radio broadcast of a space mission. And it was the first mission of John Glenn. He'd already launched. Our teacher explained that he was an astronaut and that he was flying in space way above the clouds and described the mission. And then she turned off the radio and because we had to get back to our work. But that was the first day in my life when I ever realized that this profession called astronaut existed and that this place called space existed. And yeah, absolutely. I decided at a young age that if I ever had the opportunity, I'd sure fly in space.
I can remember sitting in front of the TV. I think it was probably 1 o'clock in the morning watching the astronauts walk on the moon. That was something I'll never forget.
I can remember what you're referring to as well as the Apollo 11 landing. I think there is like 500 million people around the world that were watching the event. Although it was a NASA mission, we all felt like it was humanity that was doing this. Somehow humanity had managed to pull together all what was needed in order for us to get off the planet and explore another celestial body and redefine what it meant to be human. That Earth is just a cradle and that we have a destiny amongst the stars. That was an incredible event. I certainly remember where I was at the time as well.
TV and movies were, as you say, in the 60s, moving right along with the way society was jumping forward. Or were you a fan of shows like Star Trek and Lost in Space?
Yeah, just as much as the actual space program. I think that those programs, Star Trek in particular, did a really good job in acquainting us with some of the difficulties, the psychosocial issues that come up during space exploration. Yeah, absolutely. It kindled my interest in getting out there and working collaboratively with other entities, other people to do something audacious and boldly go.
In some ways, space travel is becoming more commonplace these days with Blue Origin, those type of programs. Your first flight was on the shuttle Columbia. So how has space travel changed since you first began your career as an astronaut?
Well, I think one of the appeal of the space program for me today is its dynamism. It has absolutely changed in the 4 decades that I've been involved in the space program. First of all, I think it's a more diverse group of entities that are flying in space. Back in my childhood days, it was 2 government space agencies that were doing most of the space exploration. It was the United States and it was the Soviet Union. And today, the space players, the space agencies have broadly increased, including Canada and Australia, New Zealand, the United Arab Emirates. A lot of the small nations around the world are also participating as well. You mentioned Blue Origin. Yeah, Blue Origin is part of this group of bold entrepreneurial companies. We'd also have to include SpaceX, Virgin Galactic, Axiom, and some of these other companies as well, who are using their own funds, not government or taxpayer-provided funds, to build rockets and get into space. Maybe the other thing I would say, Peter, is that participants are more diverse. So think about the early Mercury, the Gemini, and even the Apollo astronauts. They were all from the same point of life. They were all white. They were all men. They were all military. They were all test pilots. Today, the participants in human spaceflight are very diverse. Yeah, of course, we still need aviators to fly in space, but we also have medical doctors, scientists, physicists, even school teachers as well. So I think the space program, in summary, is a lot more diverse and equitable and inclusive than it was several decades ago. That's nice to see reflected in the space program.
Over the years, they've worked out a lot of the wrinkles with all of this. What were some of the challenges that you faced during your time in space on your first flight that perhaps some of these programs don't have to deal with now?
The space shuttle, which was the first vehicle that I flew on, had already flown 77 times before I had my opportunity to go on the shuttle. So most of the worrisome problems had been taken care of. And I'm talking about the booster rockets and the O-ring problems, things like that. Yeah, during flight, we had some small issues. We had some scientific equipment that failed. The primary purpose of my first mission was to do medical science and to do what we call materials processing or manufacturing alloys and ceramics and protein crystals in the weightless environment of space. And some of that equipment, which was flying for the first time, failed. But working with the ground support team and making use of our MacGyver skills, we were able to repair most of that equipment and come home with 100% of the science that was expected from us. So we did have some problems, minor problems, but we managed to get them all fixed.
You bring up an interesting point because one of the things I'm most interested in is what were some of the experience you were conducting during your time in space, and have we seen any direct results in our everyday life with some of these space experiments?
The research that we do has a very broad scope. So the scientific experiments that I did on my second flight aboard the International Space Station included over 100 different experiments from around the world, of course, including Canada. And these came from plant biology, animal biology, human physiology, trying to understand how the human body adapts to the weightless environment, fluid physics, combustion science, metals processing, medical demonstrations, engineering demonstrations for future missions. So the work that we do is quite broad. Peter, if there's one area, I think, in terrestrial society that has benefited from the research that we're doing, I would say it's probably healthcare. A good example might be the robotics that Canada has contributed to the space shuttle and also to the International Space Station program. The University of Calgary, for example, School of Medicine there, has teamed up with the Canadian company that manufactured the robot arm to take some of the elements of the space arm to build a neurosurgical robot. So the control algorithms, the gearing, some of the haptics, which means the force feedback systems, and built a 2-meter long neurosurgical arm, which operates today in one of the Calgary hospitals. It removes brain tumors. It corrects arteriovenous malformations. It removes blockages associated with hydrocephalus. And Calgary does that because the robot arm is just as dexterous as the hand of the best neurosurgeon, but it's more precise and it's tremor-free. So that's just one example. Some of the other work that I did aboard the International Space Station in an area called protein crystallization could lead to future treatments for some very nasty diseases on Earth. There's a disease called Duchenne muscular dystrophy, which afflicts 1 in 3,500 young boys. The outcome is always poor. And we were doing some work that was able to investigate the protein that is misbehaving in the muscles of these young boys. And hopefully in the future, we'll have a treatment for very nasty disease on Earth. So there's thousands of spin-off benefits from the investment in the space program in terms of our technology and also in terms of the research that we do.
Inspiring. I've read some accounts from some of the Apollo astronauts, and we've seen television shows and read books and all of it about how traveling in space has had a really profound effect on them. How has your time in space influenced your perspective about life on Earth?
I know what you're talking about. I can remember also reading some accounts of former Apollo lunar lander astronauts. The one most prominent in my mind is Buzz Aldrin. Following this mountaintop experience that he had on the moon with Neil Armstrong, he went into a severe depression. Some of the other astronauts did as well. I think they all recovered therapy, but Just think about it, Peter. These people did something that no other human being had ever done. The entire technology and the will and the determination and the talents of hundreds of thousands of people was focused on getting two people down to the surface of the moon. And what can you do in life for the rest of your life that comes even close to managing that? So I assume that's the reason why these astronauts had difficulties when they returned back home, when they returned to their job. But no, I haven't had that same problem. I flew twice, and I think I'm just as buoyant, as upbeat as I was before I flew or when I was flying. And I think the reason for that is that I do not define myself as an astronaut. I define myself as an explorer. I grew up in BC. The early explorers that I learned about in elementary and in high school, the indigenous peoples from hundreds of years ago, Simon Fraser, David Thompson, these were incredible people. They had all of the human attributes that I aspired to. So self-care, cross-cultural relations, teamwork, leadership, the spirit of exploration, curiosity, a desire to discover. So space is not the only field to explore. There's a number of issues in healthcare, in medicine, in science, and technology that will never go away. And that's what energizes me today. So I keep getting involved, less so in the space program, perhaps more so recently in healthcare, and in particular remote healthcare. And that energizes me. And I still consider that I have frontiers to push back and social yardsticks to move forward.
You mentioned a bit earlier your time on the International Space Station. You spent 188 days in space, and to get there, you had to launch on the Soyuz spacecraft. So somewhere along the way, you had to learn Russian. And I'm guessing your time in Russia was a bit of a cultural eye-opener.
Yes, it was a cultural eye-opener, but I enjoyed every minute of it. The Russians are very similar to Canadians when you get down to the worker and the family level. Yes, we did need to learn how to speak Russian fluently. So I took a lot of didactic lessons in Russian, but I also spent time, weeks at a time, living with Russian families in Moscow to become more proficient, more fluent in the language. And you can't do that without developing a love for the culture, understanding the people. They have the same interests and the same needs as we do, as parents and as spouses, same aspirations in life. Of course, Russians love hockey. They love the winter. So I had a great time with them. Yeah, when you get downtown Moscow and you're shopping in stores or you're going about your business in the city core, you do notice a lot of cultural differences. Those were of interest to me. And I love being in a different culture. You know, we have to be very careful as Canadians to say that Canada is God's gift to the world. We should never say that. There's a lot of other countries that are doing things right as well. Things are a little bit difficult on the geopolitical level today, and that is very unfortunate. But again, I'll emphasize that my colleagues in the Russian space program who continue to collaborate on the International Space Station program are wonderful people whose desire is simply to extend the capability of humanity into space, to inspire the next generation of young leaders, and to encourage society to take on more audacious goals. We're absolutely identical in that respect.
You spent 188 days in the International Space Station, and I'm sure they had you conducting experiments and working a full shift, maybe even a little longer every day. Can you pass along a few of the more memorable moments of your time in space?
We need another hour, but let me highlight a couple. One is, of course, that we're living in a weightless environment. In addition to a childhood dream of being an astronaut, I also had this silly dream of flying one day as well, not just in aircraft, but flying by myself. And in space, you can do that. I can fly about like Superman or jump about like Spider-Man. So I did that for 6 months at a time. And that was memorable. I can remember some moments during my stay aboard the International Space Station. I would deliberately get up in the middle of the night, 3 a.m, when the station is dark and when all my crewmates were asleep. And I just fly down from one end of the station to another end of the station and just reflect on what I was doing, just feeling special about that. Another thing was looking out the window. Spaceflight is not just a professional experience. It's not just the research and the repair work and the operational work you do. It's also a personal experience. So you cannot fly in space without being moved by the view of the Earth and our natural ecosystem from space. And It's very clear that you can see that the world is fragile, that it's vulnerable. From space, we can see the impact of human activity on the planet. I came back home with different priorities. I think I was very much moved by what we could accomplish in an international partnership. So I tend to do things on an international stage today. It's not the Kardashian family. What's important to us today is overpopulation, equity, environmental damage, poverty. Those are the big problems. In other words, survival of humanity. Looking out the window down at the planet, you think humanity be around for 10 years, humanity be around for maybe 1,000 years. But beyond that, where we're going right now, maybe not. So I think I'm a better steward of the planet today after having flown in space. It's a message that we need to pass on. Indigenous people do a really good job of talking about how everything is one, that we're all connected. I'm embarrassed to say that I had to fly to space to begin to understand that, but yeah, it did change me.
When Today in BC continues, Dr. Robert Thirsk talks about future space exploration and projects planned, as well as artificial intelligence.
Hey, it's the Moj, Bob Marjanovic. Join me on the Moj on Sports podcast on Black Press Media at todayinbc.com. Listen into conversations with well-known athletes and celebrities as we look behind the scenes at these successful people. Listen in to the Moj on Sports podcast on todayinbc.com. You'll also find the Moj on Sports podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Amazon, iHeart, YouTube, and Google Podcasts, as well as mojonsports.com.
Why spend hours searching dealerships, comparing makes and models? Find the best of BC's inventory in one place, todaysdrive.com. You'll have access to inventory across BC, where you can easily find a vehicle that fits your needs and gets you where you need to go in comfort. Get in the driver's seat. Don't miss out on the many options we have available for you. Powered by Black Press Media, todaysdrive.com connects you with exclusive new and used car deals.
Today in BC is a Black Press Media podcast. I'm Peter McCully. Dr. Robert Thirsk served as Chancellor of the University of Calgary in 2014 for 4 years and has a high school named after him in Calgary, which is a huge honor. You've spent your whole life, it seems, learning. I don't have enough fingers and toes to count the degrees, but here's a question, and it's not tongue-in-cheek. We both grew up in the time of the movie 2001: Space Odyssey, where HAL, the computer, achieves consciousness. What do you think the role of artificial intelligence will be in future space missions?
Whenever we introduce a new technology, there's always repercussions. And it seems sometimes that technology moves faster than we as society are able to cope with, put in new policies, put in new regulations. That's certainly the case with artificial intelligence today. The capabilities, ChatGPT is a good example, are moving so quickly that we don't have the regulations and the policies in place yet. With that aside, I would say that I'm very optimistic about the role that artificial intelligence will play. And the reason why I say that, Peter, is that I'm walking around a city or walking through an airport. I see that there's a lot of jobs that humans are doing that they really don't seem to be happy doing. It's not fulfilling. It's routine, repetitive work. And I think where humans excel is when we're doing creative work. Those are the skills that humans are really good at. Why should we be caught up in doing some of this routine work? So I think in my positive view of the future, I think that we can direct artificial intelligence to take over some of these mundane, repetitive tasks that bring us no joy, and have humans be able to spend more time doing what things that we're really good at. An example might be, for example, radiologists, who part of their job is to read x-rays and to read CAT scans and deliver reports. AI is very close to being able to read those x-rays as well or even better than the best radiologists. So let them do that and free up the radiologists so that they can spend more time doing interventional kind of procedures, getting to know the patients better. Maybe we'll talk about another movie, and that is Star Wars. If you can remember the first 3 movies, Luke Skywalker had a very good relationship with R2-D2, an AI entity. What R2-D2 was good at was systems monitoring and systems control. R2-D2 could plug into a socket on the Death Star and find immediately where the trash compactor was located and stop it. Whereas Luke and his other humanoid crewmates, they're good at judgment. They're good at abstract thinking. They're good at dealing with the gray zones. They're the creative people. They can make the ethical. But Luke and R2-D2 work together. There's a subdivision of tasks. Luke had certain kind of tasks, the creative, judgmental kind of task, and R2-D2 did the looking for patterns, monitoring systems. And that's the way I think that spaceflight will certainly be going that way in the next 15, 20 years when we head off to Mars. We will need a well-behaved HAL 9000, but I also see in society as well, let's have AI take over the jobs that humans really don't aspire to and let us do the stuff that's really cool.
Interesting. Recently, NASA announced the Artemis program. Could you tell us about the program and what the goals are?
Artemis is this generation's Apollo program. So the intent of Artemis is to take humans back to the moon. We have had a number of technologies that needed to be developed before we can contemplate going back to the moon. But the objective is to orbit the moon next year. A crew of 4, including 1 Canadian astronaut, Jeremy Hansen from the Canadian Space Agency, will be a member of that crew, the first time in 50 years that humanity has gone back to the moon. And then about a year after that, another crew of 4 will go back to the moon on the Artemis 3 mission. And 2 of those crew members will board SpaceX Starship vehicle and then deorbit down to the surface of the moon at the South Pole to start establishing a base there. In subsequent missions, Artemis 4, 5, 6, more astronauts will go down to this South Pole outpost and begin to develop it into a sustainable research and habitable facility. You know what? There are valid scientific reasons, geological science, for example, planetary science, to go back to the moon and stay this time. But also, what can the planetary geology of Mars tell us about the Earth's geology? What can Mars tell us about the start of life on Earth? And then also, the big question is, what could Mars tell us about the possibility of being a safe second home for humanity in the future? I don't think it's wise for us to leave Earth to go populate Mars, but I look at some of the geopolitical stuff that's going on today, and wouldn't it be good to have some human DNA, some members of our species, at a small outpost on Mars, just in case things get unlivable here on Earth? So I think Mars is the ultimate destination. And to answer your question about the purpose of Artemis, yeah, we want to go back to the moon to do a more thorough scientific investigation of the moon. But also we want to test a lot of deep space technologies on the moon in order to prepare us to get to Mars.
That was going to be my next question, is what do we have to do technologically to get to Mars? What hurdles do we have to get over?
In 1969, if you were like me, you probably thought, hey, we got on the moon in 1969. We'll probably be on Mars in 1979. That didn't happen. And for a number of good reasons. And it's because, as you mentioned, there's a lot of technologies that needed to be developed to take us to Mars. One of the technologies that we've all become aware of is heavy lift capability. SpaceX has a new super heavy rocket that they are testing right now. NASA has a new rocket called Space Launch System, which is being tested right now. It successfully flew last November, December, and will fly again on the Artemis 2 mission. We also need to learn how to land heavy payloads. The heaviest payloads that we've landed on Mars to date are the rovers Curiosity and Perseverance. They both weigh about 1 ton. They're like small cars that we've been able to land on Mars. To support a human mission, we have to land 40 tons. We don't have that capability today. So it's like landing a house on Mars. So we need to develop that capability. Another technology we'll need to develop is something called in situ resource utilization, which is a nasty sounding term, but simply means living off the land. The Mars mission will require a lot of consumables to support the crew. We cannot bring all of those consumables with us from Earth. So I'm talking about water, nitrogen, oxygen, rocket propellant. And instead, what we'll have to do is to exploit the local Mars environment, the atmosphere, the regolith, which means like the rock in the soil, that make up Mars to extract water, to extract rocket propellant as well for the trip home, and also to sustain the habitat on Mars as well. Maybe the last thing I'll mention, Peter, is energy power as well, power production. Today, most of the power to supply spacecraft and to supply habitats is solar power. We use solar arrays in space an awful lot. But there's problems with solar arrays on Mars. Mars is farther away from the sun than Earth is. And also Mars suffers from dust storms periodically, which cover the solar arrays. So we have to develop some safe, portable, compact nuclear power sources as well. So those are an example of just a few of the technological problems that need to be dealt with. There's also operational medical ones as well. We will test out some of these systems that I just mentioned on the moon. And once we have confidence in them, then we'll launch the crew to Mars.
I watched recently a documentary on the rovers, and I still can't get over the images from Mars. They're so sharp and clear, and it's just fantastic.
Yeah, I'm retired now. There's a new generation of astronauts that are out there, and we have to pass the torch to them. They're smarter and brighter and more capable than us veteran astronauts. But if someone offered me a chance to fly to Mars tomorrow, and the training was good, the risks were well managed, and I wasn't taking the seat of someone more deserving, I think I'd like to go. Those images from Curiosity and Perseverance have certainly, for me as well, been a motivator.
Well, if Captain Kirk can go back into space at 92, I'm sure that Bob can go there someday.
As I said, if someone offered it to me, I think I'm still in shape. I think I'm still capable of not messing up too much.
You touched on it briefly, but as an educator, I'm interested to know how important you think it is and how you would inspire the next generation of scientists and space explorers.
There's often journalists and politicians and government workers that come up to me and say, Bob, we love the space program, but it's so expensive and it's taking away funds that we should be devoting to social problems here on Earth. So I explained to them the great economic benefit that we get from the space program. Our industry gets much, much more revenue out of our space investments than what taxpayers put in. And then we've already talked about some of the scientific breakthroughs and some of the technological and healthcare breakthroughs. Those are practical, pragmatic benefits from the space program. Peter, I probably agree with you. I think it's the intangible benefits of the space program that are just as important or maybe even more important than the pragmatic ones. And I'm a good example of that. So when I was an elementary school student in BC, I aspired to become an astronaut, and that had an influence on the direction that my educational path went and on the direction that my career went. And it wasn't just me. There was thousands, hundreds of thousands of other young Canadians as well who were inspired by the space program and ended up getting into an educational path that took them into a STEM or science or technology, engineering or math career. And that benefited our economy. I think that investing in the space program provides us with these intangible benefits, the ones that are hard to measure, in terms of inspiring, encouraging young people to consider an educational track in science, healthcare, technology. And I think it also inspires society at large to take on some of those audacious challenges that are out there. Certainly going to the moon, going to Mars someday, that's an audacious challenge. It's near impossible. But humanity, Canadians need that kind of a challenge. You're roughly the same age as me as well. And you can remember back in the Apollo era that the saying was, if we can put a man on the moon, then why can't we fill in the blank? Develop a universal healthcare program or develop a maternity program or improve civil rights, things like that. And I think that the space program does that for us as well. If we can collaborate with space agencies, nations that used to be former Cold War enemies to do great things in space, then we can inspire a nation to become more scientific, more innovative, and to encourage the population that, yeah, we can do great things if we collaborate together.
Robert, what occupies your time now these days? What are you working on?
I've recently been involved in a national task force for the Canadian Space Agency to look at what future contributions Canada could make to the deep space exploration. So the return to the moon, and then in the next decade, sending humans off to Mars as well. In addition to technological hurdles that need to be overcome, there's also medical hurdles as well, primarily the delivery of healthcare to astronauts who are 200 million kilometers away on Mars. Realistically, Peter, this can be difficult. If you, for example, are an astronaut on Mars and I'm back on Earth at mission control helping to guide you, and you call me to say that, your crewmate, Yuri, has a cardiac arrhythmia, it will take 20 minutes for me to hear your report. And it will take another 20 minutes for you to hear from me to deploy the defibrillator. So clearly, medical care has to become a lot more automated, AI-enabled, that will help us. So Canada is a world leader in terms of the delivery of remote care. We're not perfect at it. Certainly, Canadians who live in remote and rural areas of the country do not receive as good health care as those of us who live in Vancouver, Calgary, Winnipeg, Toronto, Montreal. There's a lot of training that we do in Canada for family physicians and rural physicians. There's a lot of innovations in portable imaging that work out very well for delivery to our Indigenous and other populations in Northern Canada that we could also apply to distant celestial bodies as well. I'm hoping that Canada will take up the challenge to develop a new area of space expertise, a new niche area in remote healthcare delivery that we can contribute to future spaceflight. Of course, it will bring benefit to Canadians here on Earth as well.
Once in a while, we grab something from the mailbag, Robert, and this question: do you have an astronaut nickname?
Unfortunately, I do. Do you remember a long time ago, there used to be a show on TV called The Muppet Show?
Oh, yeah.
And there's one character there, he was Dr. Bob. And I think he was a dog with floppy ears. And my first flight, I got called Dr. Bob. All of us have nicknames. We usually don't like to mention what they are because often the nicknames come from when we messed up. I'm proud of that one.
Robert, do you think we're alone in the universe?
In our galaxy, Milky Way, there's 10, if not 100 billion star systems out there. And thanks to some of the recent work by space probes, Kepler and Hubble and James Webb Space Telescope, we're getting an inkling that in each of these star systems, there's at least one planet there as well. So if you consider that there's 100,000 planets out there, it'd be naive to think that there is not many planets out there that have had the same evolution conditions that Earth has had: a source of energy, liquid water, presence, some biochemical magic that happened as well. To answer your question, I would say, yeah, I do believe that there's alien life out there somewhere, maybe even intelligent life. I do not see any credible evidence that there have been any aliens that have visited Earth to date. The reason for that is the distances that are involved. The nearest star system to Earth is like 4 light years away, 4 light years. And using conventional rockets today, we wanted to go and visit there. It would take us tens of thousands of years to get there. So it's just the distances that are involved in our galaxy that have precluded alien civilizations of contacting Earth or visiting Earth. So I'm very skeptical about extraterrestrials having ever been amongst us. But yeah, I do think there's a very good chance that there is intelligent life out there. Having said that, I'd also like to say that it could be that we're it as well in terms of intelligent life. So it behooves us to take good care of this planet, be good stewards of this planet, because we might be it.
I'd like to thank Dr. Robert Thirsk for being with us on this edition of Today in BC. If you have suggestions or comments, send a voice message to podcast@blackpress.ca. You may be part of our podcast mailbag segment. You'll find Today in BC podcasts on iTunes, Spotify, Amazon, iHeart, and Google Podcasts.